Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 13 transfer plans. This is a pretty interesting game week here because I would say with Game Week 13, you have a lot of people making the same move, right? A lot of people have already made this move. This move would be something like a Dominic Calvert-Lewin or any other striker really within the game moving to João Pedro. And if you have multiple other free transfers, you're probably making moves there as well. Ironically, I think my team, because of some of the moves that I've made a few weeks ago, is in a spot where I'm happy, I guess, to sidestep João Pedro this week, and I'll talk about that in terms of my transfer plans later on. But quickly just recapping this game week, I think just to sort of touch base in terms of what I think about my team. I've had, once again, a very, very good game week. We know the Newcastle game is still to go. I have one player in that game. In terms of Newcastle, I clearly don't have Isak. He's an amazing pick. I said that I was feeling jealous about people who had the chance to go there. But at the same time, I'm looking at my team, and I think I'm pretty happy owning Solanke. And so if I scroll down, really, I mean, this is sort of the team that I have, right? Ultimately, it's Flecken and the boys. Flecken finally coming good. I mean, we knew this would eventually happen, right? Regardless of how bad you are as a defense, I suppose you're still capable of getting a clean sheet here and there. Ipswich, for example, have gotten a clean sheet. Their performances recently have actually been quite good. So this isn't going to be some sort of Ipswich shaming session, but that's the point. So I think when I look at someone like Flecken, when he's got Leicester at home, there's nothing really to do here. Clearly, there might be moves in the future where I could think about moving off of Flecken. And I think a lot of other managers are looking at different spots in their team where when you move a forward towards João Pedro, you know you've got a lot of money in the team. And that can be something like a Flecken to Raya move in the future for myself. And that's definitely something I'll keep an open eye to. As far as, let's say, my actual defense, I made a move towards Lewis Hall. The reason why I actually went to Lewis Hall in the end by the deadline is because the Dunk news was actually not exactly good. And as it turns out, Dunk was not a part of the squad that participated in the game versus Bournemouth, which Brighton eventually won. And it doesn't seem like he's fully available, I suppose, or fully fit for the Southampton game. Another point to mention too is Igor seems like he's played really, really well. So arguably there's a chance that someone like Dunk might not even feature for this next match in Southampton at home. Maybe on the basis of sort of his fitness, or even on the basis of whether I guess he deserves to get his starting spot back immediately. I do think Dunk will play good minutes in the future, but the issue right now is if I can't guarantee him playing the Southampton home game, I would need more defenders. And as we saw this week when I owned, or still own technically, two Man City defenders, it's not ideal to really play them versus much better opposition when it comes to the sort of offensive element of the game, right? They've played good teams that are clearly going to finish within the top 6 or top 7 within Brighton, Spurs recently. Even Bournemouth arguably have played like a very top half offense, and Liverpool next is no better at Anfield. So yes, Man City defense hasn't looked great recently, and it actually continues to look worse and worse in terms of the team strength and where that's moving on defense. But I still think there are some valuable things to mention here, right? Lewis has still had really, really good minutes, even better than I expected. I actually thought he would be benched this week, and he started. As far as Guardiola, he's playing in some sort of ridiculous offensive position. He might be one of their better attackers. I think just my reflection on that Spurs game is, yes, of course, Spurs deserve the win quite thoroughly, but still think that City actually built quite a few chances. And so when we look at the underlying data, Guardiola actually probably had his best offensive game of the season in terms of the creative side of the game as well, and just the amount of good offensive chances he got, as opposed to the usual where he just scores an absolute screamer, that sort of thing. So I think, yeah, there are going to be games in the season where Guardiola can do that, and I think that's always going to be the appeal towards Guardiola, which I love in my team. Lewis Hall, as I said, was the transfer that I made, because the nice thing about Newcastle is if I actually look at their fixtures, one thing to talk about is I was pretty confident that Rico Lewis would play on Game Week 14. That's Nottingham Forest at home for Man City. And that's immediately after the Anfield game because there's a short turnaround. So when Lewis Hall actually has his worst game over this entire run here with Liverpool at home, I actually feel quite confident that, I'm fine to keep Rico Lewis. And that's also why I decided to go out of Leif Davis instead and keep Rico Lewis despite the things like the price drops. And obviously my understanding that City defense has noticeably dropped off. As far as someone like Gabriel, Flecken, these are players that are probably going to stay in my team because I don't still see them as issues for now. Obviously, if I go for something like the João Pedro move, there's a lot of flexibility on what I can do to upgrade my team. I'll probably talk about that actually at the end of this, just to sort of illustrate what types of players I can go into, but I'll talk about my specific transfer plans later on. So that's just a key point to raise. As far as, let's say, the midfield, just touching on that, I really wanted to do Son to Saka, and to be honest, by the end of the deadline, I was pretty convinced that Saka would play because we had enough news. But it also seems like we didn't have any good consistent leaks on Arsenal, because I saw a predicted lineup that actually had Saka starting, and as it turns out, no one that I could really see in the Twitter timeline actually said that Havertz was benched. So I think it's pretty clear we might have some Arsenal news, but it's not always clear whether they're actually true. And, you know, I may or may not be in the cartel, but I didn't have any news on Saka. And I still felt that Son would play some good minutes. And that was a wrong call. I think looking back at maybe international duty and Son's age and the injury aspect, he's going to enter this December period, and he's going to be an issue for me, because if he plays 90 minutes, for example, let's say in Asia, comes back from an international break and can only play 60 minutes versus a team like Man City, ultimately he's going to have less minutes over this period. He might get rested in European games, and he might do the occasional, let's say 45 minutes, 30 minutes off the bench in European games. But even still, I think there's enough depth in the team to sort of rest him a little bit more, right? And that 90 minutes, which he played, for example, versus Ipswich, isn't always guaranteed. So I am a little bit concerned over Son, but he has a really good fixture here in Gameweek 13. And I do think so does Saka equally, which is going to be West Ham away. But do I think it's actually worth to make the move this week? Other than the price impacts, which should, impact Saka positively and Saka should rise, I still think that holding Son is nice. He is still with substantially low ownership, and I like the appeal of ultimately having a home game here versus Fulham, where I have a differential player who I think is still very, very good, and gives me a lot of expected points that a lot of the field don't really have, whilst everyone else is still moving into Saka and busy moving into there. Maybe I'll actually regret this more often than not over the next few weeks, which I think I already have. Even the move of Saka to Son itself has not really paid out whatsoever. The minutes haven't been great because of sort of the injury related issues with Son. And even though Saka, for example, has missed some of his games here and there and missed minutes, he's ultimately outscored Son for quite a fair bit. So we'll see what happens. I think it's a move where I don't really mind owning Son, because I still think he has a pedigree. He's still on penalties, things like that. Happy to own him for now. As far as Mbeumo, we did discuss about how he could be a sell quite soon. I think that I'm probably going to be targeting a transfer for him, potentially for Bruno in a few weeks' time. But as I said in some of my previous videos, I didn't really want to go to Bruno recently because I just didn't think that the fixtures were good enough when we consider that he still has Arsenal and Man City, and I don't really have quite enough rotation, I suppose, for now. But I'm sure I will in the future. It might be the case that I still keep someone like Mbeumo, but I do think that he can be a sell, particularly if Eze comes back, things like that. Those are the types of players that I'd be looking to in terms of Eze and Bruno. Some people might laugh, but yeah, those are the players I'd still be looking at. And there's some interest as well within some of the other Manchester United midfielders. They didn't actually play a very good game versus Ipswich, but more minutes for someone like Amad Diallo intrigues me, because it could structurally change my team quite a bit. I could actually go for players like, let's say, Trent, and even some better attackers like in the forward position when, let's say, Cunha's fixtures get a bit worse, or if I suddenly don't want Solanke anymore. So that's something I've been thinking about too, that we might be having a little bit more flexibility in the midfield if we can trust in someone like Amad Diallo in a few game weeks' time. And that could be someone sitting in that Mbeumo spot in my team. As far as Palmer, look, I think anyone who actually watched that game of football knows that Palmer was pretty unlucky to not score one goal at least. But other than that, he has such an elite fixture run. I don't really need to be talking about Cole Palmer up until Game Week 23. So that's the discussion closed. And I'm sure a lot of people can make the same point about Jackson. So I clearly could have maybe gone for Jackson from Solanke this week, but I still think when I look at a team like Spurs, I feel equally good about them too, right? There is one tough game here with Liverpool at home, but their run of games is actually quite sweet still up until, I would say, Game Week 20. So yes, Bournemouth away isn't ideal. Chelsea at home I still think is actually quite good, particularly when you actually look at how disorganized Chelsea still look. I thought Leicester had plenty of chances, and we don't even really hold Leicester in much regard as a team. Obviously, Steve Cooper got sacked as well, so I guess we'll monitor that situation with Leicester. But yeah, there are more than enough good games here within this Spurs run where I can actually see myself holding Solanke for the most part. And those are my thoughts in terms of someone like Solanke, where a lot of people, yes, of course, have already gone into Isak and already gone into Jackson. To me, that's a bit of a luxury transfer. And I think, once again, if I had the opportunity to do it, and maybe if I was a bit more passive and saved a free transfer over the international break, I would be sitting here as an Isak owner. But to me, Solanke still looks perfectly fine as an FPL pick, and I'm going to continue owning him as an FPL pick. And The last thing I wanted to touch on, as I said, was just what can João Pedro give me as a transfer. So if I go into the transfer page and I, let's say, prospectively transfer out, I think both Cunha and Wood can go, but arguably I could be moving, let's say, someone like Wood out of my team, and I could be going into João Pedro. The question mark here is, what can I do with that sort of money? I think, first of all, the most obvious one to me is if Trent comes back, I can always do Guardiola to Trent. And this could be, if I have zero faith in, let's say, the City defense, I could always do that. The alternative move, as I mentioned, is something like ultimately Mbeumo to Bruno. And that's something that I can definitely do. Because when I look at Bruno's run of games, maybe let's say outside of the Man City fixture, this is a generally good run of games, like 16 plus. There's obviously a Liverpool game here as well, which we need to monitor. But generally speaking, if we have much more confidence in a team like United in a few weeks' time, Bruno is definitely a transfer that I can go into away from Mbeumo, who, if I restore here, just has a really, really poor run of games, right? Aston Villa away, Chelsea away, Brighton away, Arsenal, these sorts of fixtures just aren't good enough ultimately. So there's a bit of value, I think, in maybe moving away from Mbeumo. But at the same time, I don't think he's, yes, of course, Brentford have noticeably had some bad games. I think we've always mentioned that whenever they have an away game or even tougher fixtures, we've seen, generally speaking, the performance on the attacking end just has been really dire. So when you look at, for example, some of the good games for Mbeumo, these are when he's had absolutely nuclear hauls. And I guess it doesn't always happen like that, right? We have a team like Tottenham in FPL who, over the course of the season, have had some great results versus big teams, awful results versus smaller teams. And Mbeumo might be the perfect analytics representation of what it's like to have good games and bad games. And there's only more bad games to come for a team like Brentford. So after Leicester at home, I can see a lot of people moving out of him, and that's something to think about. So with João Pedro, the other flexibility that I have is simply to go out of Flecken and into Raya, right? Because when I just showed you the Brentford games, I mean, that's applicable to Flecken as well. Yes, of course, he can make saves. He's made the most saves out of any keeper this season, but the point still applies that he's probably going to be conceding more goals than he has already. And so someone like Raya over this run is actually another very beautiful pick that I can move into in a few weeks' time, maybe even starting from game week 14 or 15. So that's something that I've been thinking about too, like what João Pedro can do. And ultimately, I think that the sooner that I bring João Pedro into my team, the earlier I can make some upgrades in other positions. But the beauty, I suppose, is that there's flexibility there by going for João Pedro. And he's a bit of a cheat code, ultimately, from an FPL point of view, because if I don't go for Raya, I can even do things like, once again, going back into Isak if I really care for it. So there's a lot of flexibility that João Pedro brings, and I think a lot of managers will be sort of in the same situation where as long as you make that João Pedro move, everything else can fall into place later on. And my thoughts are that I have some concerns over Dunk, as I said, no concerns over Hall for now, no concerns over Lewis, really, because at the end of the day, I own him at 4.6. 4.6, I think, is a justified price, even if City were, let's say, only a top 6, top 7 defense and had the games that they have, where I still expect Rico to play, right? If I keep Rico for the long term, I'm still seeing Rico playing for me for games like Nottingham Forest at home, Crystal Palace away, Everton at home, Leicester away. These sorts of games I'm very comfortably going to be playing Lewis for. So I still think there's some value towards Lewis. And as I said with Guardiola, yes, the defense has clearly dropped off a cliff, but his attack is still very real and I think very tangible. And when we put a lot of value towards attacking fullbacks in the game, he's clearly one of them. So those are my thoughts really in my team right now. But let's quickly switch over to the Fantasy Football Hub client and have a look at how I would manage my team over the next few weeks with my transfer plans for Gameweek 13 plus. So we're actually back here with the Fantasy Football Hub My Team Pick and Rating tool. So this is a tool that I use every week to sort of monitor my transfer plans. I'll walk you through them very quickly, but having a look at the link in the bio, as I said, there's actually a great deal in place right now, which is the Fantasy Football Hub Green offer. It's a free trial effectively for a month. You can cancel while the trial is still in place, and actually you can just use all the tools that you want, which I think are very helpful in terms of actually making sure that you make the most informed decisions and also back some of your decisions with some of the advanced data available. So if you're interested in using some of these tools to help bolster your rank, climb up your mini leagues, have a look at the link in bio below, and you'll be able to access some of these tools for free. So Game Week 13, starting from here, I've already optimized my team, so to speak. I've actually changed a few things around. I've benched Guardiola, I've benched Lewis, even though I would say the AI probably thinks that Hall and Dunk are better. I still think this is a much better fixture for Hall and Dunk as long as they're available and fit to start. So that's going to be how I'm going to play it. As far as captaincy, I would much rather captain Palmer, even though Salah has been so good and City have been so bad. I think that maybe my vice could even be Mbumo, arguably. But right now, the vice is on Salah. A lot of people will be going to João Pedro. And I mentioned previously already that João Pedro is the most intriguing transfer to look into, or even player to look into. But right now, I still think that I don't really need to make that sort of move. The biggest pressing thing for me in this game week, as I said, is I could do something like Wood to João Pedro, which is totally luxury, and Son to Saka as well, which is, in my opinion, in this game week, also totally luxury, because this is a much better game for Son compared to, let's say, the swing between Son and Saka last week. I already lost out, net on that transfer. It doesn't make I'm going to get last week's points back. However, Son to Saka is definitely going to be a move that I plan to make in the future anyways. Going for a Hall actually saved me another 0.1 million in terms of my team structure. So I think I have a little bit more flexibility now, and João Pedro, once he comes into the team, eventually all the cards are open really and on the table. So those are my thoughts right now. As far as Wood, I think he's a very easy play this game week, as I said, and that's why João Pedro isn't going to be someone that I bring in game week 13. On game week 14, the big question mark is going to be whether I really want to make a move. And I think that I could make a move on game week 14, which is going to be doing Wood to João Pedro and potentially actually just benching Rodgers, particularly if I just think that ultimately my thoughts on a lot of the midfielders and forwards right now in those sort of cheap positions is that the midfielders really do pale in comparison to the forwards, and there's a lot more value to come from the forwards. João Pedro, Fulham away, might actually just be better straight up than Rodgers, Brentford at home, particularly since Aston Villa will actually have a lot of fixture rotation around this period because of the Champions League games that are very tough for them that they will have to manage for, which is also why I think we saw something like Dean getting benched over the weekend, because he was also involved in the international break. So those kind of elements come into play when making decisions, and those are my thoughts. Because I rolled as well, I can easily do Son to Saka on this game week, and I think that's actually going to be the move that I actually make. By going for Son to Saka, I still have 1.1 million in the bank. My team still looks really strong. I would be playing both City defenders here. I still think Lewis is a very strong pick in the good fixtures for Man City. Ultimately, I think if they're facing off a bottom half offense, which is definitely Nottingham Forest, I still have the confidence in playing someone like Lewis, and I'm okay with doing that. So that's going to be the team on paper. In this situation, I'm definitely going to be captaining Palmer. The vice captain is a tough one. It probably is going to be Saka on a game week like this, and I'm actually pretty happy with this team as things stand. So I'll make these transfers, and that's that. As far as game week 15, though, this is a week where we can consider if the move to go for Bruno is something that I need to do or something that is once again luxury. So the way I see it, 1.1 million, I can definitely do Bruno in on this game week, and it might just be a little bit better than, let's say, what Mbumo has, which is Newcastle at home. There's not exactly too much to be gained, I would say, between Mbumo and Bruno over the 2 game weeks, which would be 15 and 16. So this would be totally a luxury move once again. And I suppose what I need to be asking myself is whether I'd actually like to go for a move at all on this game week, right? So this is totally, I would say, a luxury move, and I might not need to make it. So suppose I go for Bruno here. The only way I would really optimize my team once again is I'd probably have to once again reconsider whether I want to play Rodgers over Cunha, because I can see myself playing João Pedro most definitely, and Rodgers just has such a good game here. I might actually be benching Cunha here versus West Ham. It really depends on also how we think West Ham is improving as a team, whether they've developed at all, whether they've even sacked Lopetegui, for example. Things like that will definitely come into my decision making. It might even be a Solanke that I bench here in this game week, but there's a lot of choice here, and maybe once, as I said, the transfer towards Bruno would be a little bit too flexible. So maybe in this case, let's say if I bench Rodgers, which I'm not looking to do it, but it has to once again come down to how the Aston Villa minutes are developing. On game week 16 plus, I still think there aren't too many moves to make in the far future. So once we get towards a juncture like this, there's a lot of Lewis Hall and even Lewis Dunk action. I have a lot more rotation now that I have 5 defenders in place. The only player that clearly isn't great here is Bruno, and that's why the Mbumo transfer isn't perfect. There is the odd question of this game week here where he's got Man City away. It might not be a great game, but I still think my team for this game week is actually relatively strong. One thing that I have thought about too is ultimately, I guess I could also go for someone like Martin Odegaard, right? Like thinking back towards game week 15, if I, let's say, maybe don't go out of Mbumo, I could very well just go for someone like Martin Odegaard instead. And the only weird thing, I suppose, is that ideally, if I bring in someone like Martin Odegaard, I'd love to bring him in game week 14, where Arsenal actually have a fixture at home. versus a team that still looks relatively poor, right? Man United haven't looked anything that good under Amorim, and I think it will take time, but they've got way too many fixtures to really sort of organize themselves as a team, and there aren't any breaks in the Premier League scheduling or even some of the European scheduling. So yes, that's something that I've definitely thought about. If I make these two moves in Game Week 14 and I actually move out of Son, I guess like I can't really, make any perfect moves. And it comes down to also whether I really want João Pedro that badly, because maybe there could be a case where I just go Son to Saka and I actually go for a role as well, right? João Pedro isn't someone that I necessarily need to go for in this game week. I could simply also just be playing Rodgers instead, and then João Pedro could be someone that I'm actually bringing in instead on Game Week 15. Because if I bring João Pedro in Game Week 15, that's when I can consider the idea of just bringing João Pedro and Odegaard as a pairing in this game week, where it probably makes a little bit more sense once again. So the nice thing is that once again, because if I roll this week in Game Week 13 on Game Week 14, I only really need to make one transfer if I really want to, which is Son to Saka. After that, everything is quite dependent. Like I can make that João Pedro move any game week I really want to after Game Week 14. And another question I suppose is also, how bad do we really think Chris Wood is, right? He's got Man City away. I'm clearly going to rotate him anyways. My plan was to play Rodgers this whole time, but any of the fixtures after that in terms of 15 to let's say 19 are actually relatively good still, I would say, for a player of Chris Wood's quality. What just seems to be the case though is that ultimately Pedro has better fixtures, even though some of them are away, and he's going to save me a lot more money and he's going to be able to enable me to make better moves. So it's a question between Cunha and Chris Wood. I think Cunha has been playing equally good to Chris, really, in a much different way, right? Cunha is a creative player. He's a talisman type player. Chris Wood is a talisman in the sense that all the chances that Nottingham Forest traditionally tend to build are for him, and he gets on to the end of them and gets really high quality sort of shot positions. Whereas Cunha, we've seen screamers from him, great assists, a lot of creativity, a lot of ball carrying, etc. So different players, but routes towards points in FPL are just routes towards points. It's just about whether players really produce XA, XG, are good finishers, aren't such bad finishers as well, and things like that. So yeah, ultimately moving out of Wood or Cunha is probably another question mark that I'd like to leave for myself. Cunha's moved up in price a lot, and that's nice, but there's really no reason to sell someone like Cunha up until even after probably Game Week 17. And even still, United at home is a great game. So there could be a long time where I sit with Cunha in my team, and it's a question of him versus Wood. So maybe it's the case that I actually move out of Wood instead, and I go out of João Pedro, and then obviously a lot of the transfers after these game weeks are totally luxury to me, outside of maybe Son to Saka, which I think is still forced at this point in time on Game Week 14. Everything after that is, as I said, totally luxury, and it just comes down to I have really good rotation with my team, finally, and I've got hopefully players like Dunk coming into the team. But in a few weeks' time, if we find out that things like, for example, Dunk is no longer first choice, or Lewis is getting worse minutes, or I don't even know, maybe we have even less confidence in someone like Solanke for whatever reason, then I can make some other moves that aren't, for example, something like Mbumo to Bruno, even though I would say if I look at Bruno's overall fixture run, generally speaking, like 16 or 15 plus, it's much better than Mbumo's fixture run anyways. And we have already looked into that a few weeks back. I remember when just discussing Mbumo was either probably a Game Week 14 or 17 move. Here I'm suggesting that I might go out of him on Game Week 15, but that's simply because it might be the case that, Game Week 14, as with let's say Bruno, is not a particularly good game week. So if I'm actually angling for Mbumo to be a Bruno placeholder, that's that. In the midfield, though, we obviously still have a lot of other options. We have players like Bowen still about, Johnson, that could be quite interesting, although we're starting to see a bit of a reduction of minutes if Maddison comes back into the team, which was always the case, and some more United midfielders, not just Bruno. So ultimately, if we get towards this game week here, and Bruno actually is someone that is still interesting, but actually Amad Diallo's played a lot of minutes, or Garnacho's played a lot of minutes, or Rashford has still sort of maintained a little bit of center forward share, which I think is unlikely. I think Rashford is actually the player that I've always thought would be losing out the most amount of minutes under Amorim, and I thought Garnacho could be playing either left wing back or in the 10 spot. If Amad can also do the same thing where he can play right wing back or play in the 10 spot, then actually that's probably, those two players are also going to be identifiably good picks that actually save us a lot of money if we want to make moves like, for example, Trent in the future. I don't know exactly when Trent is back. It seems like he could be back sooner than later, but someone like Trent can easily be a transfer in Game Week 15 as well, right? Game Week 15 is a really, really good fixture for a team like Liverpool, so I can definitely consider that sort of move. even as soon as game week 14 as well. But I think that's once again stretching it because I do want to do Son to Saka as a move. So those are my transfer plans right now. As I said, rolling this week, game week 14, moving into Saka, maybe a João Pedro move as well. That gives me the luxury to choose things like, maybe if I keep Mbeumo, for example, I could still do Guardiola to Trent on game week 15 instead. So that flexibility is still in place. And then the weeks itself plays itself really after that, because I've got 5 attackers, 5 defenders, 8 attackers. The only other moves that I could really make, I guess, later down the line would be maybe moving out of Flecken when the fixtures are really bad. And I guess that would be a totally luxury transfer, but I could be moving into someone like Verbruggen as well. So those are my thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys have a wonderful game week and enjoy that sort of Newcastle versus West Ham game. But otherwise, take care and goodbye.